Hello, this is John with 8Asians, and I'm here with my friend Rowena Chiu, who last fall had publicly come out in regards to calling out Harvey Weinstein and her sexual assault, which she had even kept secret from her husband for many, many years. So thank you for taking the time to speak. And I'm wondering how this whole experience the past couple of months has been and how it's impacted the Asian American community.
Yeah, well, it's been an interesting few months since I came out. I wasn't sure what to expect after my first appearance on the NBC Today Show, but overwhelmingly I've had a lot of response to my story that's been very positive and very supportive, and of course I've had extra special support from the Asian American community, which I'm very grateful for. I wrote in the New York Times in early October about the intersectionality between racism and sexism in my Harvey Weinstein story specifically. Issues of how he used race, overtly to attempt to persuade me to have sex with him. So he would say things like, "Well, I've never had a Chinese girl," or "I like Chinese girls because they're discreet." Some of these issues then kind of came to the fore in terms of my article. They entered an arena where we had talked about the kind of silencing of Asian victims of sexual assault. How not only did, Asian victims are placed in a situation where they're at greater risk of assault, but also after an assault unfortunately happens, it can be harder for people, say from a Chinese background or an Indian background, where sexual assault isn't commonly spoken about in a family situation or even among friends, to come forward and to be public with their stories, either in a family setting or in a wider, more public setting.
Sure. I mean, I think you had mentioned, or I'd read somewhere where oftentimes they'll blame the woman for not dressing appropriately or just other issues where it's not really the man's fault. And I know in Japan most recently there was a rape attempt that was settled where they convicted the male, where that was a really big deal in Japan. I'm curious, what are your thoughts now with you speaking out? Are you seeing more openness in the community to discuss this issue?
Well, I think that the culture of victim blaming is kind of very prevalent across all races and all colours. So I don't necessarily think that Asian cultures are more victim blaming. But I think in my op-ed I was trying to allude to the fact really that within Asian families it's really hard to talk about emotions, not just sexual assault, but emotions generally, feelings, emotions, this kind of thing. So I think that because there's generally a culture of avoiding difficult subjects, that extends to sexual assault. Well, actually, it extends quite broadly to sort of doing a job in a profession that your parents don't approve of, all the way up to sexual assault. So there's a sort of culture of not communicating about things that you might feel deeply about or topics that are difficult. So I'm not saying that it's necessarily only Asian cultures that don't talk about these kinds of things, because it's also true in Western cultures that it's difficult to talk about sexual assault. But I think there's an additional culture of silence in the public arena. There's certainly an additional culture around model minority, where often Asian people work in the workplace are expected to kind of put their head down and get on with things. So certainly in terms of relevance to Harvey's alleged assault on me, we talked about how Asian women don't complain. Asian women keep secrets. Asian women are very discreet, is the word that he used. And I think in the context of the subsequent sexual assault and, publicly now many women have come forward, that's pretty chilling. It's a form of power and it's a form of intimidation.
And so also I'd read that one thing that's definitely not talked about a lot in the Asian American communities around mental illness and suicide. And I had read that you had attempted suicide twice, so that's obviously very disheartening to have read. I was wondering, back then when you had attempted suicide, what kind of help, or did, even this is difficult for me to ask, what what brought you to those kinds of states those two times?
Well, I think that the suicide attempts which took place in Hong Kong were really a reaction to being entirely isolated. As now has been made quite public, the other assistant, Zelda Perkins, and I were entirely silenced by our NDA to an incredible extent. So, widely they talk about how we were not able to talk to doctors or therapists or lawyers unless those professionals signed an undertaking with Harvey's lawyers in London. So we were in a complete bind where I did try to go to therapy. I attempted to say, well, hello, Mr. Therapist, I'm Rowena Chiu, I'm 24, something terrible happened to me in London, I can't talk about it, I can't talk about it with whom or how it happened, I can't say whether it's in a personal setting or a professional setting, but if you sign this letter saying to these lawyers in London that you'll never talk about it again, I can be more open with the details. Well, I don't think any professional worth their salt, be they a doctor or a lawyer or a therapist, would take on that level of professional risk without knowing anything about the client or anything about what they wanted to talk about. So in terms of, coming to a point of suicide, we were completely isolated from getting any kind of professional help, but we were also completely isolated from our personal lives. Many people talk about how I had been married to my husband for 10 years and I had 4 children with him when the story broke in October 2017, and so they emphasize, how did you manage to keep a secret from your husband for 10 years, be married and have 4 children and still not talk about this? I mean, that is one thing that is difficult, and that certainly wasn't easy, but what doesn't occur to journalists asking these kind of questions is, what about when I was 24, I had a group of friends at university that I was close with, that I talked about, and we all, be in our first jobs in whatever industry we were working in, and we might go down the pub and have a pint. But as soon as I signed this NDA, I wasn't allowed to talk about anything that happened at Miramax. I wasn't really even allowed to, I was just allowed to allude to the fact I worked for Harvey. So I think that kind of imprisoning and that kind of isolating can be really damaging, certainly for a young woman at 24, and likely equally damaging for women later in their careers.
So yeah, I was kind of curious in regards to your husband. I mean, he knew that you had worked for Harvey in the past, so did he ever bring that up, especially when the whole allegations came publicly out? And
well, the allegations didn't come publicly out until he knew of my involvement in the Me Too story. So Joe Decanter came to this very house, in fact, and accosted him on the driveway as he was cleaning out our minivan in August 2017. And so prior to that, Harvey was regarded as still the most powerful man in Hollywood, and there wasn't, the story hadn't yet broken.
Right.
So when Jodie came to this house, the story, it was before she wrote up the story in the New York Times. So I was aware of it when the article was published in October 2017.
Because I know when I first heard about it, I talked to one of my colleagues who used to work in Hollywood, and she had heard rumors about Harvey. I was like, oh yeah, like everybody knew in Hollywood. So, I mean, but obviously I'm not from the entertainment industry, so prior to the New York Times article, I was not at all aware. So
I think everyone in Hollywood knew that Harvey had a reputation, but I think that when the story broke in the New York Times, the extent of his predilection and his depravity was a shock even to those of us who had directly worked for Harvey, and even to many of us who were at Miramax.
Right.
So it's still, it's still fair to say that the story caused shock ripples within Hollywood, even though Harvey had a reputation for being difficult, and even though he had a reputation for being, a bit of a sex pest. I don't think anyone believed that he was faithful to his wife, but there's a difference between thinking that your boss is an adulterer and has a bit of liking for women to knowing that he's a serial rapist who held multiple women down against their will.
And I'm curious, I mean, with you coming out publicly, how have your parents reacted?
Well, the parents haven't expressly said a lot, but they were in attendance at my talk in London, and so they are quietly supportive in the way that Asian parents are.
Okay, that's good to know. Excuse me. And so, going forward, what are some of the things that you'd like to express to the, or what other engagements have you had or plan on having to the Asian community that you'd like to, I guess, articulate?
So I've been grateful that my story has been very well covered by NBC Asian America, thanks to the efforts of Kim Yam, who I must give a shout out to there. And I've also been involved in some advocacy work in New York among non-profits that represent Asian Americans who are voiceless or silenced or unrepresented in some way. And that might be for a whole variety of reasons. They may be lower income, they may work for hourly wage, they may be illegal immigrants. So we're talking about communities that represent people who work in with the hotel cleaning trade, or with the Vietnamese nail salon technician community, and so on and so forth. Many of these communities, the women work for very low wages, their grasp of English may not be that great, and they may be in the country illegally. And so it is really difficult to get representation and to understand the stories of these women. And many of them face sexual assault in the workplace on a daily basis, and yet they have very few people to speak out for them, and they're underrepresented not only in terms of advocacy but also in terms of the law and in terms of the political system, where these people are essentially invisible. And so I think it's really important that if I am to take on more representation within Asian American advocacy for sexual assault in the workplace, that those of us who are able to speak out and have a much bigger platform, can speak out for those who are silenced and voiceless.
And my final question would be, recently you were invited to the State of the Union by a congresswoman from Massachusetts, if I recall correctly. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the Be Heard Act and the efforts around that.
Absolutely. In fact, it connects very, very well to the question that we have just had before. So the Be Heard Act is an act that's being proposed by a group of Democratic congresswomen called the Democratic Women's Caucus, and it is about extending current EEOC regulations outside of what you would consider to be the standard employee. So EEOC regulations could be extended to part-time workers, tipped workers, people that work for organizations of less than 15, people who are paid lower than a living wage. And so again, although the Be Heard Act is not specifically targeted at women or people of color, in fact, in practice, because it extends the regulations to people who work part-time, who work for tipped wage, who work in these lower paid industries, and so on and so forth, in effect, the Be Heard Act would help cover many more women, disproportionately more women, and in particular, disproportionately more women of colour. And so from that point of view, it fits very well with my advocacy for Asian American groups that are silenced and voiceless. It'll enable them to bring a case of sexual assault via EEOC, which means that it will be at no cost to them, and they would have representation and access to a lawyer who can advocate for them, firstly through the court system, but also in the English language.
Well, thank you for your thoughts, and again, it was a complete, total surprise, obviously, when I had heard that you were in fact the Rowena Chiu that I was reading about, that I knew, and had just come here to this home a few days earlier to your kid's birthday party. So I can't even imagine all the press and exposure this has been for you, but thank you for coming out to speak forward. Again, thank you.
Of course.